ATCH306. So I am working on my online reading quest, and I'm kind of doing it in a different setting than some other people. I'm actually at a school in a classroom right now. It's Sunday. Um, Usually there is advertisement right here, and I tried to make this video a little bit ago, which is weird because it was PS3 games being advertised right here, and when I reloaded the page, it says, oh, ignore that. That can be a distraction right there. It says that the access was blocked. So being on a school server, let's say I try to go to Facebook, that's blocked. Twitter, oh, not TCH. Twitter, blocked. Even Pinterest is blocked. Wow, I can't type. Pinterest is blocked. So I was kind of against online reading when I first tried to do this video, but now seeing that I'm at a school and kids would be at school reading this, the distractions are kind of blocked and they can't get to other sites like Facebook instead of reading the article. So it's kind of interesting. So I found this article on verge.com. It's about Pixar's senior scientist explains how math makes the movies and games we love. Me being a math person, I really think it's really important for my students to know that math is everywhere and it's not just something that they need to know for school. Says applied research by Tony DeRose and his colleagues take animators from simple polygons to the limits of geometric storytelling. So as you can see over here on the right-hand side, this would be advertisements that would be flashing or showing different kinds of advertisements, but with the servers blocked, there's nothing but blue squares with question marks in them. Not as distracting as the different advertisements. So right here in the picture, we see that this is going to be Tony DeRose, and he's up here, and he's about to give his presentation to the group in the audience. We can see that we can share this article on Facebook, Twitter, whatever InShare is, and Pinterest. So it starts off with saying that Tony DeRose wanders between rows at New York's Museum of Mathematics. In a brightly colored button-up t-shirt that may be Pixar standard issue, he doesn't look like the stereotype of a scientist. He greets throngs of squirrely, nerdy children and their handlers, parents and grandparents, math and science teachers, as well as their grown-up math nerd counterparts, who came alone or with their friends. One 20-something has a credit for crowd animation on Cars 2. He's brought his mom. She wants to meet the pioneer whose work lets her son do what he does. It's wonderful to see such a diverse crowd, he says. How many of you have seen a Pixar film? He asks. After taking the podium, the entire room's hand go up. How many of you have seen 3? 5. He pauses. How many have you seen all of them? Dozens of people raise their hands, maybe a quarter of the room. Wow, he says. He smiles to himself and the crowd. This gig is not one bit bad. The topic of DeRose's lecture is math in the movies. This topic is his job, translating principles of arithmetic, geometry, and algebra into software that renders objects or powers physics engines. This process is much the same at Pixar as it is at other computer animation or video game studios, he explains. Part of why he's here is to explain why aspiring animators and game designers need a solid base in mathematics. As Pixar's senior scientist, DeRose has more than a solid base. PhD in computer science, specialty in computational physics, a decade as a professor of computer science and engineering at the University of Washington. This is the first instance of the Math Encounters lecture series at MoMath's new campus in Midtown Manhattan, but DeRose given a version of this talk many times before, continually updating it as Pixar's technology improves and fans want to hear about the latest films. So actually, over here to the right-hand side, we see that some of these things aren't being blocked by the server here. So we have different articles that are about Twitter, Airbnb, Kindle, Apple Pay has a Siri problem. So some of these did get through the server. Whether they're appropriate for them or not, I'm not sure. If we keep scrolling down here, we come to an image with very bright red hair. Might catch a student off guard if they're not expecting something so bright. The article goes on to say that hair, cloth, fluids, and gaseous phenomena like clouds, smoke, and fire all have their own physics at Pixar. These basic engines are then augmented to try to produce specific outcomes. Simulating water is easy, says DeRose. What's hard is, how do you make water more directable? For Brave, DeRose explains Merida's voluminous, bright red, highly animated curls required building an entirely new physics engine. The studio's animators had to figure out how to make Merida's hair beautiful, expressive, and even more living than lifelike. DeRose and his team of scientists had to engineer a model that makes that animation computationally possible. In the real world, hair keeps its bounciness and volume by constantly colliding with itself, DeRose says. Merida's hair is made of 100,000 individual elements. If you know any combinatorics, you know that if you have an in objects, you have n squared possible collisions, he says, or 10 billion. How can you render so many collisions quickly enough to be usable? You have to create a new spatial data structure that culls extraneous collisions without being too lossy. Instead of a quick and dirty compression algorithm like MP3 or JPEG, Pixar has to create the equivalent of the PNG or the FLAC for animating hair. I really do think that if I had a group of 8th graders, they could read this article and could learn something from it. This part, I would say right here, could kind of lose them, make them confused. It's kind of a mouthful, and it's even hard for me to comprehend what exactly they're saying here. Then it gives us a diagram says the figure 2 is the control mesh for Jerry's head created by digitizing a full-scale model sculpted out of clay. So then over here you can see the different shapes that they would use for like his nose or his eyes. Computer animation, DeRose says, frequently deals with modeling objects at greater scale and detail than even physicists typically deal with in their computations. Much of his work involves finding better algorithms to intelligently approximate this kind of scale without sacrificing detail. Directors will say, oh, it's just a small thing in the background, we'll never see it. Directors lie, DeRose explained, and if every time a director changed his or her mind, objects or characters had to have their underlying physics redesigned from scratch, it would be impossible for Pixar to make a movie every year with 4 teams working at once. DeRose's most important contribution to computer animation has come from new ways of quickly generating smooth curves with high fidelity. It's all about turning complicated shapes into some form that computers will deal with. For years, in both computer animation and video games, this meant mapping 3-dimensional object with planar facets or polygons. But the problem with polygons is that at close detail, you can see every one of them, a fatal problem when the illusion depends on ignoring individual frames and pixels. The trend has been to replace polygons with parabolas, curving surfaces that are continuous at arbitrary levels of detail. But you still need to define these curves quickly to match a finite number of points or planes. So mathematicians have worked to develop different methods for quickly generating smoothly curved surfaces. These are typically called subdivision surfaces because of how they are calculated, by repeatedly splitting and averaging the midpoint of a line. The first time subdivision surfaces were used extensively in computer animation was in the Oscar-winning 1997 Pixar short, Jerry's Game, which actually, that makes sense about Jerry because up here, this is actually Jerry's face being created. Side note. The leap between this film and earlier polygon-based animation is startling. It simply looks like Pixar. DeRose adapted his scholarly work on calculating wavelets on multi-dimensional surfaces to create a new curve-generating algorithm. And while it first was used only to solve especially thorny problems in animating characters, the complex shape of an old man's nose, the particular warp and woof and movement of cloth, it's now used for nearly every object in Pixar's film. DeRose shows a still from The Incredibles and gestures to the background. You might be surprised that the building, its windows, all the details are generated with subdivision surfaces, he says. What started with a single short, and before that, applied research by DeRose and other computer scientists, has become an industry standard. DeRose and the research team at Pixar continue to publish papers and apply new techniques to their software engines, but the studio doesn't have the same lead in R&D and proprietary software it once had. Controlling lighting and shading or defining the parameters for a character Mariante used to be huge challenges to mathematically define and then engineer code. Now, says DeRose, open source software like Blender can do almost everything Pixar software can do. Last summer, Pixar even open sourced its subdivision surface code library. We had a competitive advantage for 10 years, DeRose says, but now we get more value by letting everyone contribute. Actually, this paragraph right here, I feel like would be a little over their head. It was even kind of hard for me to understand what exactly are they saying here. And then the last paragraph says that Pixar's biggest competitive advantage now is its ability to use this math-driven technology not to make better shapes, but to tell better stories. DeRose and the Pixar aren't sitting on their laurels. Somewhere out there, a brilliant kid and their friends are working in their garage, using and improving on tools like Blender. DeRose tells the assembled children and adults at MoMath that they will be the next Pixar. And then at the very bottom, we have some more from The Verge, just different random articles. And then it looks like a video of the Best Verge video. And then again, we see that the access is blocked from this. So, and then the comments don't even show up. So I'm not sure if those are blocked as well. But it's interesting to see what topics get blocked on the server and what actually make it through. But this is the article I chose. I think if I was doing this at home and I could see all the different advertisements, I would probably be kind of more against giving my students the option to read a text online in class because there are so many different distractions, and one student, it might be hard for them to actually sit here and follow along. They might be bored with it and want to go surf the web and go to Facebook. I definitely like the idea that if I was doing this in class, and a tip I would give my students to be able to follow along is use their cursor. Moving it along as they're reading definitely helps keep them on track and focused of what they're reading, or even highlighting as they go along each paragraph and then starting over at the next paragraph. Something I did notice at Bloomington Junior High School is in my CT's room, she actually has a program that allows her to see on everybody's laptops. So when she assigns them to be working on their math homework, or even what's another website they use? Moby Max, I think it is. When they're working on that stuff, she can actually sit here and see what each individual laptop is doing, and are they actually doing their work, or are they being distracted and doing on another website? I think if I had that tool in my classroom, I would definitely not be against using online text in the classroom, because I definitely think it's very environmentally safe, much safer than printing off all the articles for the kids and wasting paper, because the kids probably aren't going to keep the articles and they'll probably just go to the garbage. Let's see. Another thing is, I think if my students were to read out loud, it would definitely help them read critically, because they're able to verbally think of the text of what's going on. They're able to read it with pauses. They're able to read it with expression. It definitely makes the text come alive for them and be able to read it critically. Other than that, I think that is it. I definitely like having this experience of reading in a classroom with a school server that does block the advertisements. Definitely helped me. I'm very, oh, look, a squirrel. So it definitely helped that I didn't have advertisements blowing up over here, flashing to different screens. But that's all I have, TCH 306.